The night the city drowned in rain, Charles Donovan's life changed forever. The storm had been hammering San Francisco for hours, and inside his glass mansion on Pacific Heights, the billionaire tech magnate was still awake, surrounded by blue screens and silence. He didn't believe in miracles, only in numbers. But that was before the knock, soft at first, then desperate, echoing through the marble halls of a man who thought he had everything. When he opened the door, what he found wasn't a business deal or a beggar. It was a child, no taller than his desk, clutching a soaked piece of paper and whispering words that would haunt him. "Sir, please, I need a job. I have to buy milk for my brother." If you think you've heard every story about kindness and redemption, stay with this one, because what happens next will challenge everything you believe about power, money, and love. "What would you have done if it were your door?" she knocked on. Charles stood frozen. She couldn't have been older than 9, skinny pale, her small face half hidden under a hood, dripping water onto the marble floor. The paper she held trembled in her hands, its ink running into messy blue rivers. He almost closed the door, assuming it was some prank. But there was something in her eyes, calm, too, calm for a child, that made him stop. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze without fear. "I need a job," she repeated. "My brother's hungry. We ran out of milk." Charles's butler stepped forward, ready to escort her out, but Charles raised a hand. "Wait." He knelt slightly to meet her eye level. "Where's your mother?" "She's gone," the girl said simply. "It's just me and Evan. He's only 2. The words hit like a strike to the chest. He should have felt pity, but what he felt was recognition, that same hollow ache he'd buried for years. Sophie, his daughter, had been 7 when she died. Same age, same brown hair that used to stick to her cheeks after a storm like this. "What's your name?" "Lila." The name lingered in the air, small but strong. Her lips were trembling now, but she refused to cry. She straightened her shoulders like someone who'd already learned the world doesn't listen unless you sound grown. He wanted to tell her to go home, that this wasn't how life worked. But something inside him, something long dead, whispered otherwise. "You came all the way here in this weather." "Yes, sir," she said. "I saw your name on the building downtown. People say you can fix anything." That line pierced deeper than she could know. Fix anything. He could build satellites, close billion-dollar deals, restructure global corporations, but he hadn't been able to fix the one thing that mattered. His wife had left after their daughter's death, taking the light with her. For years, his home had been nothing but glass and echoes. The rain grew heavier, slapping against the windows. Lila swayed slightly on her feet. Without another thought, Charles stepped aside. "Come in." The warmth of the house hit her immediately, and she gasped softly, her fingers thawing. The butler looked alarmed, but Charles ignored him. He took the soggy paper from her hand. It was a child's attempt at a resume, lines written in uneven pencil. "I can clean. I can help. I don't cry. I learn fast." A crooked heart was drawn in the corner. Charles felt his throat tighten. "Who wrote this, me?" she said proudly. "Evan can't write yet." He tried to hide a smile. "That's impressive. Can I start tomorrow?" she asked, so matter-of-fact that it broke something in him. He gestured toward the living room. "Sit down, Lila." She hesitated before perching on the edge of a leather couch big enough to swallow her. Her shoes squished water onto the rug. She didn't seem to notice. "Where do you live?" he asked. "Behind the laundromat near 16th Street. It's warm if the machines are on. And your brother with a friend. I told her I'd be right back." The clock ticked in the silence that followed. Charles stared at her, this fragile, determined little creature, and something inside him shifted. He poured her a cup of hot cocoa himself, ignoring the stunned look from his staff. She took it with both hands, whispering a thank you so soft it nearly vanished under the storm. When she drank, he noticed her fingers' bruised knuckles, small cuts, evidence of survival, not childhood. "How old are you?" he asked. "Almost 10. 10-year-olds should be asleep, not asking for jobs." She looked up, unblinking. 10-year-olds don't get to choose when their brother's hungry. That silence was heavier than any boardroom meeting he'd ever sat through. Finally, Charles leaned back, exhaling slowly. "You're not in trouble, Lila. I just don't understand why you came here. There are other places." "No one listens," she interrupted, "but they listen to you." It was such an innocent sentence, but it landed like a confession. For years, people had listened to him, investors, politicians, journalists, but never for something that mattered. She finished her cocoa, setting the cup carefully on a coaster, as though afraid to break it. "I can work for free," she said softly. "Just until Evan's better." He shook his head, not out of refusal, but disbelief. "You remind me of someone I knew. Was she poor, too?" He smiled faintly. "No, but she was brave like you." The lights flickered as thunder rolled overhead. Outside, the world felt distant, muffled by the storm. Charles realized how absurd this all was, a billionaire and a barefoot child sharing cocoa at midnight. And yet it felt more real than anything in his life lately. He looked at her once more, really looked, and saw not a problem to solve, but a spark of purpose he'd long forgotten existed. "Lila," he said quietly, "I can't promise you a job tonight. But I can promise you this: you won't have to worry about milk again." Her lips parted in disbelief. "Really, really," he said. As he led her toward the guest room to rest, lightning flashed again, and for a brief second he saw her turn back toward him with a tiny, uncertain smile, the kind that made him wonder whether fate sometimes knocks just once, and it's up to us to open the door. What Charles didn't know yet was that this door would not just save her, it would save him too. The morning light poured through the massive windows of Charles Donovan's mansion, cutting across the marble like thin gold threads. The storm had passed, but its ghost lingered, the faint drip of water from the eaves, the smell of damp earth, and the soft, uneven breathing of a child asleep on the velvet couch. Lila had curled herself into a corner, still clutching her backpack like it held her entire world. Charles stood at a distance, unsure what to do with the sight. It had been years since anyone had slept under that roof who wasn't paid to be there. He told himself it was temporary, one night, that's all. But when she stirred and whispered, "Is it morning already?" something in his chest tightened. He nodded, motioning for her to follow him to the kitchen. The staff watched in stunned silence as their boss poured cereal into a bowl himself. "Do you like strawberries?" he asked, trying to sound casual. She blinked at the question. "Never had one." That answer hit harder than he expected. He slid the bowl across to her and sat opposite. For a moment, the silence between them was fragile, like glass about to crack. "Lila," he said, "last night you mentioned your brother. Evan, right? Where is he now?" She swallowed, her voice small. "Still with Mrs. Hayes. She lives near the laundromat. She's nice, but she's old. Sometimes she forgets to lock the door, and I get scared when I have to leave him." Charles leaned forward. "How long has it been like this?" "Since Mom got sick," she said simply. "She used to clean houses, but then she couldn't walk much. After she didn't wake up, I tried to keep us together." He didn't interrupt. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She was just stating facts, the kind of truth that leaves no room for tears. "I sold some of her things. Evan needed food. I found cans behind stores sometimes." "It's okay." Charles stared at her in disbelief. "That's not okay," he said quietly. Lila looked up then, meeting his eyes. It's better than being hungry. For a man who'd built his life on logic and control, her words carried a brutal kind of wisdom he couldn't argue with. He wanted to tell her that no child should have to say things like that, but what good were words? So he said nothing, just watched her eat slow and polite, like she didn't want to take too much. Later that morning, as she explored the house, Lila stopped in front of a framed photograph in the hallway. It was a picture of a smiling girl with long blonde hair, her arm wrapped around a golden retriever. "She's pretty," Lila said. "Is she your daughter?" Charles froze. Was he corrected softly? Her name was Sophie. Lila turned toward him. "She looks happy." She was. His voice cracked a little. Until the accident. The word hung in the air like smoke. He hadn't spoken it aloud in years. Even his closest friends had learned not to mention her name. Lila didn't ask for details. She simply nodded, and after a moment she said, "I think she'd like you helping Evan and me." That single sentence hit him harder than any eulogy ever had. He had spent years building walls made of glass and steel, convinced they'd protect him from feeling anything again. But this girl, this small, determined stranger, had walked right through them. That evening, Charles drove Lila back to the laundromat to pick up her brother. The neighborhood was a different world from his own cracked sidewalks, neon signs buzzing the smell of grease and rain. Lila led him to a dim alley behind the building, where an old woman sat by a heater made from a coffee can. Beside her, wrapped in a thin blanket, was Evan, tiny, drowsy, with curls matted against his forehead. When Lila knelt beside him, the boy reached out and clutched her sleeve. Charles's chest tightened again. He crouched down, studying the child's small face. "Hi there, Evan," he said softly. The boy blinked sleepily and smiled a smile so innocent it almost hurt to see. Mrs. Hayes explained in a trembling voice how Lila had been coming and going for weeks, doing odd jobs for change trading chores for food. "Smart little girl," she said, patting Lila's head. "But she can't keep this up forever." Charles stood silent, rain dripping from his coat, the city lights flickering off the puddles. He saw his reflection in the wet pavement, a man who had once thought he'd seen the worst of loss now, realizing he'd only been looking at himself. "Pack their things," he said quietly. Lila looked up, startled. "What? You and your brother? You're both coming with me?" Her eyes widened. "You mean, to your house?" He nodded. "Just for a few days, until we figure something out." She hesitated, torn between hope and disbelief. "People don't just do that," she whispered. "I used to think that too," he said. "Let's change that." The drive back was silent, except for the hum of the city fading behind them. Lila sat in the back seat holding Evan, closer eyes fixed on the skyline. Charles glanced at her through the rearview mirror. For the first time in years, he didn't see a stranger in the reflection. He saw a second chance. When they arrived, Lila carried her brother into the guest room, settling him gently on the bed. She turned to Charles, unsure what to say. He handed her a blanket, and for a brief moment their eyes met his, filled with something she couldn't yet name hers, with gratitude she couldn't yet express. "Good night, Lila," he said. "Good night, Mr. Donovan." As he walked down the hall, he passed the photograph of Sophie again. For the first time since she'd died, he didn't look away. The silence of the house no longer felt empty. It felt like it was listening, waiting. In that quiet, Charles understood that this was no accident. Fate had brought a broken girl and a grieving man to the same door, not to save each other's pasts, but to give both of them a future. The first week in the Donovan mansion was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Charles wasn't used to the sound of laughter echoing through his home, or any sound that wasn't mechanical or deliberate. Now there were small footsteps racing across the hallway, the faint hum of a lullaby coming from the guest room, and sometimes soft giggles that made his staff glance at one another as if to confirm it was real. Lila and Evan had changed the air in the house, and though Charles didn't admit it out loud, he could feel it too. Each morning began the same way. Charles would come downstairs expecting silence, only to find Lila already awake, balancing on a stool, as she tried to pour cereal for her brother. She always greeted him the same way, cheerful, unassuming, like she belonged there. "Good morning, Mr. Donovan. I didn't spill this time." He'd smile despite himself. "That's progress." Evan would babble something unintelligible, face smeared with milk, and Lila would laugh the kind of laugh that made even the coldest spaces feel alive. Charles started spending more time in the kitchen, partly because he didn't want to admit how much he enjoyed watching them. He found himself learning things he never cared to before: how to toast bread without burning it, how to make hot cocoa the way Lila liked extra marshmallows because it tastes like happy. It wasn't long before she took over the household in her own small way. The butler, who'd once run the home like a quiet museum, now took instructions from a 9-year-old who insisted the dining table needed flowers. "It feels less lonely that way," she'd said, arranging wild daisies she found by the gate. Charles caught himself watching her often. The way she hummed while folding napkins. The way she comforted her brother when he cried. She had a steadiness that most adults lacked, a kind of courage born not from innocence, but from surviving too much too soon. He admired her for it, and it frightened him. One afternoon, he found her sitting by the koi pond, sketching on a notepad. He sat beside her quietly. "What are you drawing?" he asked. She turned the pad around. It was a picture of a big house with 3 stick figures, one tall, one small, one tiny. "Us," she said, smiling shyly. "You, me, and Evan." Charles looked at the drawing for a long moment. "That's quite a promotion," he said softly. "I didn't know I was part of the family." Lila shrugged. "You let us stay. That means you care." He wanted to tell her it wasn't that simple, that kindness didn't automatically make you family. But looking at her, he realized she was right. Family wasn't about blood. It was about who showed up when no one else did. That night, while reading the news in his study, Charles came across an article that made his stomach tighten. A journalist had written about him, reclusive billionaire sheltering homeless children. There were photos taken through the gate. His PR team called within hours, insisting he handle the situation before it turned into a scandal. "This isn't good for your image," his assistant warned. "You'll need to make a statement. Distance yourself from this story." For a moment, the old Charles, the one obsessed with control, resurfaced. He considered what he'd say, how he'd craft the perfect narrative. But when he turned and saw Lila asleep on the couch with Evan tucked against her, his anger dissolved. They looked peaceful, safe. For once, he didn't care about image. He cared about them. The next morning, while his team waited for instructions, Charles simply said, "No comment." Instead, he took Lila and Evan to the park overlooking the bay. Lila's eyes widened at the carousel, her laughter rising above the seagulls' cries. Evan clapped at every horse that passed. Charles hadn't set foot in that park since Sophie's funeral. Now, as he watched Lila spin under the sunlight, something inside him eased. The memories didn't hurt as sharply. They felt softer, like they were finally being rewritten. When they returned home, Lila found an old wooden box on a shelf. She wound the key, and music began to play, a slow, haunting melody that made Charles freeze. Sophie's music box. He hadn't touched it in a decade. Lila didn't notice his expression at first. She was swaying to the tune, smiling. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Charles sat beside her, his voice low. "It belonged to my daughter." "I know," she said quietly. "You miss her?" He nodded, unable to speak. Lila took his hand, small and warm, against his. Maybe she sent us to you, so you wouldn't be lonely anymore." Tears burned at the corners of his eyes. He squeezed her hand gently. Maybe she did. That night he stood by the window watching the city lights flicker below. For years he'd believed his heart was a locked room. But Lila had walked in uninvited and opened every window. He could breathe again. The days that followed were lighter. They baked cookies that came out half-burnt, fed the koi fish names like Pancake and Marshmallow, and turned the mansion from a shrine into something that felt alive. Charles started canceling meetings just to be home by dinner. The stock price could wait, laughter couldn't, but the peace wouldn't last. One morning, a black car pulled up outside the gate. His board members had come unannounced, their faces tight with judgment. "We need to talk," one of them said. "This situation is spiraling." Lila, watching from the stairs, sensed the tension. She didn't understand the words, but she recognized the tone, the kind that meant bad things were coming. Charles stood firm, though his heart raced. He'd spent his life fighting for power, yet this was the first time he'd ever fought for love. As the men left, he turned toward the staircase. Lila was gone. In the silence that followed, Charles realized he'd just stepped into a different kind of battle, one that would test not his empire but his soul. The call came just after sunrise. Charles had been standing in the kitchen pouring Lila's favorite cocoa into 2 mugs when his phone began to buzz with the kind of urgency that only meant trouble. The board's emergency meeting had been moved up, and this time they weren't just asking questions, they were ready to act. When he arrived at the Donovan Tower downtown, every face around the table looked grim. There were printed headlines scattered across the polished mahogany: "Tech billionaire adopts street kids. CEOs reckless. Behavior raises concerns among investors." His chief financial officer spoke first. "Charles, we've tried to manage this quietly, but the situation is hurting the company. Our partners are asking questions we can't answer." He said nothing, staring at the photographs on the table, him walking through the park with Lila and Evan, her hand in his. The picture made the front page of every business paper in the city. They looked like a family, and that apparently was bad for business. Another voice cut in, sharper this time. "You're a public figure, Charles, a symbol of precision control, professionalism. You can't be seen playing dad to strangers off the street." He finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "They're not strangers." The room went silent. The chairman cleared his throat. "You have a responsibility to your shareholders. We're asking you to make a public statement clarifying your relationship with those children and to arrange for them to be placed with proper guardians." Proper guardians. The phrase tasted like ash in his mouth. He looked around the table, realizing how hollow these men were, how small they sounded, talking about image and control, while 2 children were at home waiting for breakfast. "I won't do it," he said. "You're leaving us no choice," the chairman replied. "If you can't separate your personal life from the company, we'll have to separate you from the company." Charles didn't flinch. "Then, do what you have to do." By the time he returned home, the morning light had turned harsh. Lila was sitting on the porch steps with Evan in her lap, feeding him crackers. She looked up when she heard the car door slam, searching his face for clues. "You look mad," she said softly. He forced a smile. "Just a long meeting?" She nodded, but he could tell she didn't believe him. Children had a way of sensing the truth beneath silence. That night, after he put Evan to bed, Charles sat alone in his office. Papers were piled on his desk, legal drafts board, correspondence contracts, all meaningless now. He picked up a pen, tried to focus, but his thoughts kept circling back to her voice. "You let us stay. That means you care." He did care, more than he should, maybe more than he'd ever allowed himself to, and that terrified him. When the phone rang again, it wasn't the board, it was his lawyer. "Charles," the man said cautiously, "you're being voted out tomorrow. Majority's already secured." Charles closed his eyes. "Thank you." He didn't tell Lila that night. He couldn't. She was sitting on the rug with Evan teaching him to stack toy blocks. She looked up and smiled, completely unaware that everything around her was about to change. For a moment, he wondered what Sophie would have thought if she'd lived, if she would have laughed the same way with that mixture of innocence and stubbornness that made every dark room seem brighter. He went to bed late, but sleep never came. Around dawn, he heard soft footsteps in the hallway. When he opened the door, Lila was standing there, eyes red, holding her little backpack. "Where are you going?" he asked. She hesitated. "I heard you on the phone last night." His heart sank. "Lila, they're taking your job because of us," she said, voice trembling. "I don't want you to get in trouble. We can go back to Mrs. Hayes. We'll be okay." He stepped closer. "You think this is about trouble?" Tears welled in her eyes. "You have everything. I don't want to ruin that." Charles knelt down, gripping her shoulders gently. "You didn't ruin anything. You reminded me what mattered. I spent my life building walls to keep the world out, and then you showed up, and suddenly I could feel again." She shook her head. "You shouldn't lose everything because of me." He smiled sadly. "Lila, I'm not losing anything. I'm finally choosing something." She blinked up at him, confused, as he continued. "You and Evan, you're not charity, you're family. And I'm not letting anyone take that away." For the first time, he saw her cry. Not the quiet, steady tears of survival, but the raw kind, the kind that meant she finally felt safe enough to fall apart. He pulled her into his arms and held her until the shaking stopped. Later that morning, he walked into the boardroom not as a CEO, but as a man who had made peace with his decision. They stripped him of his title before noon. Cameras waited outside, microphones flashing in his face, but he said nothing. He didn't need to explain himself to the world. When he arrived home that afternoon, the house was quiet again. He found Lila and Evan in the garden, sitting beside the koi pond. Lila looked up nervous. "Did they fire you?" He smiled, kneeling beside her. "They did." "Are you mad?" He shook his head. "No, I'm free." She didn't understand completely, but she smiled anyway, and that was enough. As the sun dipped behind the hills, Charles took out a folded piece of paper from his jacket, a legal document freshly signed. He placed it on the table in front of her. "What's this?" she asked. "It means you and Evan never have to worry about leaving again," he said softly. "It means I'm your guardian now, if you'll have me." Her eyes widened, then filled with tears. She threw her arms around him, her voice muffled against his chest. "You already are." That night, as the city lights shimmered below, Charles sat by the window holding the signed papers, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, peace. The empire he'd built might have fallen, but what stood in its place was far stronger. For the first time since Sophie's death, he didn't feel alone. He felt alive. The mansion no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a home. The echo of footsteps that once bounced off the marble floors had been replaced by the rhythm of laughter, the scurry of small feet, the kind of noise that gave a house a pulse. The staff, once stiff and mechanical, now smiled easily. Even the air smelled different, like cinnamon crayons and sunlight. It had been 3 months since Charles Donovan walked away from his company, from the endless meetings and hollow victories. He'd traded boardrooms for breakfast tables, investor calls for bedtime stories. And though some nights he still woke up at 3 a.m., out of old habit, reaching for a phone that no longer rang with urgency, he would look down the hall and see the soft glow coming from Lila's room. That reminder, that quiet proof that he hadn't imagined it all, was enough to let him fall back asleep. Lila had blossomed in those months. The shy, guarded girl who once measured every word now filled the house with questions, laughter, and drawings. Her imagination painted the world in colors Charles hadn't noticed in years. She had turned the East Wing, once his late daughter Sophie's unused playroom, into what she called the workshop of wonder. It was a space for painting, reading, and dreaming. She even placed a small wooden sign above the door that read, "No sad thoughts allowed." Evan, now toddling everywhere, had a smile that could melt the hardest heart. He followed Charles around the garden like a shadow, always clutching a toy truck or one of the koi fish crackers Lila made for him. When he called Charles Papa for the first time, the word struck like lightning, a sudden, raw, beautiful. Charles pretended to be calm, but Lila caught the way his eyes shimmered. "See," she teased gently, "he's already decided your family." Charles smiled. "Then I suppose there's no going back." Still, even in the peace of their new life, there were moments that carried the weight of old wounds. Charles sometimes stood by the window at dusk, staring at the skyline where the Donovan Tower rose like a ghost of his past. He wondered what the board was doing without him, whether the empire he built still thrived or crumbled. But each time the sound of Lila's voice reading aloud or calling for him from the garden pulled him back to the present. One crisp autumn morning, Lila came running into his study, waving a newspaper. "Mr. Donovan, look," she said breathlessly, though she rarely called him that anymore. "It's about you." He took the paper, expecting more gossip. But this time it was different. The headline read, "Former CEO Charles Donovan launches foundation for homeless youth." Beneath it was a photo of him, Lila, and Evan at a small community center ribbon-cutting ceremony the day before. He hadn't realized the press had been there. Lila grinned. "You're famous again, but this time for the good kind of reason." He smiled faintly. "You think so?" She nodded. "You didn't just build a company, you're building something that helps kids like me. That's bigger." Her words carried the simple wisdom that had guided him through every difficult decision since the day she knocked on his door. He'd created the Donovan Foundation quietly with one clear purpose: to give children without homes a chance to find safety, education, and belonging. It started small, one renovated shelter, then two, but it was growing fast. He poured his own fortune into it without hesitation. He had once built towers of glass and steel. Now he was building futures. That winter, Lila began attending school again. On her first day, she wore a blue dress and new shoes that squeaked on the polished floor. Charles waited outside in the car longer than he meant to, watching her walk through the gates, her small frame swallowed by a sea of children. For the first time, she looked like any other kid, safe, confident, free. It was the sight he hadn't known he needed to see. When she came home that afternoon, she threw her backpack onto the couch and exclaimed, "Guess what? Papa, I joined the art club." The word "Papa" still stunned him every time. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," he said, pretending not to choke on emotion. She smiled, holding up a flyer. "They're having a contest. The theme is, 'What home means to you?' Can I paint something from here, of course," he said. "This is your home." A week later, she presented her finished piece. It showed the mansion's garden under a golden sky, daisies blooming near the pond, and three figures holding hands. Across the top, in her neat handwriting, she had written, "A home made of second chances." Charles stared at it for a long time before speaking. "That's beautiful, Lila." "It's true," she said simply. "You gave us one. And you gave yourself one, too." The painting won first prize. The school asked permission to display it in the front hallway, and Charles, who had once measured his success by stock charts and profit margins, realized that no award he'd ever received came close to what he felt that day. Years began to pass quietly, softly. Lila grew into a bright young woman with a fire in her spirit, and a kindness that mirrored his late daughter's. Evan became a curious boy who loved science and spent hours by the koi pond sketching inventions in his notebook. Charles's hair turned silver. His steps slowed. But his heart, once a locked vault, remained full. He found purpose in mentoring others at the foundation, teaching young men and women about business ethics, responsibility, and compassion. Lila often accompanied him to those events, speaking with confidence about the power of kindness and the importance of second chances. One evening, they stood together on the terrace watching the sunset over the city. The skyline glowed in the distance, the same skyline that had once symbolized everything he thought he wanted. "You know," Lila said, resting her chin on her hand, "I used to think the world was divided into people who had everything and people who had nothing. But it's not. Some people just forget what they already have." He turned to her with a soft smile. "And what do I have?" She looked at him, her eyes gentle but steady. "You have us." The wind rustled the daisies in the garden below, the same daisies she'd planted years ago when she first arrived. They had multiplied, covering the soil in waves of white and gold. Charles felt the weight of her words settle in his heart like truth made tangible. "Yes," he said quietly, "I do." When he passed away peacefully 5 years later, the Donovan Foundation had expanded to 12 cities. At his memorial, Lila spoke before a packed hall, her voice clear and strong. "He used to say, 'The world measures success by what you own,'" she told the crowd. "But he taught me that real success is measured by what you give and by the doors you never close." Outside, the flags of the foundation fluttered in the wind, each bearing the same motto that had become his legacy, a home made of second chances. And somewhere in the hush that followed, it was easy to believe that Charles Donovan, the man who once lived in silence, was smiling. When the story of Charles Donovan comes full circle, it's not just about a billionaire and 2 children, it's about the rediscovery of what truly matters. A man who once measured life in profits and performance found redemption in the smallest act of compassion, opening his door on a stormy night. Lila, the little girl who came only to ask for milk, gave him something far more powerful: purpose. And Evan, with his innocent smile, reminded him that love doesn't need to be earned, it only needs to be given. Through their journey, we saw how wealth can build walls, but kindness can tear them down. We watched as a mansion turned into a home, as grief transformed into gratitude, and as loneliness was replaced by laughter. Charles didn't just save 2 children from hunger, he saved himself from emptiness. His story reminds us that sometimes life doesn't change through grand gestures or miracles. It changes through a single act of humanity, through the courage to care when no one else will. The lesson here runs deep. No matter who you are or what you've lost, there's always a door you can open for someone else or for yourself. In a world that often celebrates success and speed, this story whispers a quieter truth. Our greatest legacy isn't what we build, but who we lift up along the way. The compassion we offer today might be the lifeline someone else clings to tomorrow. So maybe the next time someone knocks literally or figuratively, you'll pause before turning them away. You never know whose life you might change, or how much your own might be transformed in return. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share it with someone who believes in kindness. Your support helps us keep creating stories that remind the world love still wins and second chances are real.